The sun had just begun its slow ascent over the city of Atlanta, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. Marcus Ellington, dressed in a tailored navy suit, stepped out of his sleek electric car. The quiet hum of the vehicle's engine faded as the soft rustling of the morning breeze took over. The private airport before him was a hub for the elite, a place where success wasn't just admired, it was expected. Marcus paused, taking in the scene. Despite his years of success, he couldn't help but feel a familiar pang of pride mixed with anticipation. Today was pivotal. His company, Ellington Aviation, was on the cusp of a merger that could transform it into a global leader in the private aviation market. He glanced at the jet waiting on the tarmac, a symbol of everything he'd built through grit, determination, and vision. The sleek, modern design of the plane gleamed in the early light. The Ellington Aviation logo, a pair of silver wings flanking the letter E, stood proudly on the fuselage. This plane wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a testament to how far he'd come. Marcus adjusted his tie, grabbed his briefcase, and strode toward the aircraft. His polished dress shoes clicked softly against the tarmac. A few ground crew members stood nearby, chatting, but their conversation quieted as they noticed him. He nodded politely, but their reactions were guarded, professional yet distant. Marcus felt their eyes on him as he approached his jet. He exhaled, shaking off the unease. It wasn't unusual for him to encounter these subtle reactions. Success had brought him many things: wealth, influence, freedom, but it hadn't erased the suspicions he sometimes faced. Marcus climbed the short staircase to the jet and entered the cabin. Inside, the pristine interior radiated understated luxury: polished leather seats, minimalist design, and advanced avionics systems. He took a moment to review his flight plan, a ritual that brought him focus and calm. Flying had always been more than a means to an end for Marcus. It was his passion. Long before founding Ellington Aviation, he'd earned his pilot's license. Now, piloting his jet was a personal reminder of the heights he'd reached. As he ran through his pre-flight checklist, Marcus glanced out the window. He noticed one of the ground crew, a stocky man with a furrowed brow, speaking to another worker while gesturing toward the plane. Their conversation ended quickly as they both turned to look in his direction. Something about their expressions made his chest tighten. He had been here before, not at this airport, but in this situation. The narrowing eyes, the quick glances, the quiet murmurs. It was the subtle language of suspicion. Marcus decided to ignore it. He focused on his task, running through the avionics systems and confirming the fuel levels. But the unease lingered, like a shadow creeping across the edges of his thoughts. As he prepared to start the engines, a voice from outside interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus turned to see the stocky ground crew member standing at the base of the stairs, accompanied by another worker. The man's tone was polite, but there was an undercurrent of hesitation, almost as if he were reluctant to speak. "Yes," Marcus replied, stepping down from the jet. "Are you the pilot for this aircraft?" the man asked. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I am. Is there a problem?" The worker shifted uncomfortably. "Just making sure. We've been asked to double-check some details before you take off." Standard procedure. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Everything is in order. I've already provided all the necessary documentation." The man nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that Marcus recognized all too well. Before Marcus could respond further, a black and white patrol car pulled up near the tarmac. Two police officers stepped out, their postures stiff and authoritative. Marcus's heart sank. He had a bad feeling about this. The older of the two officers, a stocky man with a buzz cut, approached Marcus. His partner, younger and wiry, followed closely behind, clutching a clipboard. "Good morning, sir," the older officer said, his tone brisk. "We received a call about suspicious activity involving this aircraft. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Marcus frowned. "Suspicious activity? I'm the owner of this jet. Is there a problem? We just need to verify that, the younger officer said, his voice tinged with skepticism. Do you have identification? Marcus handed over his pilot's license, registration papers, and company documentation. The younger officer examined them, his expression unreadable, while his partner scanned the jet with a critical eye. This your plane? The older officer asked, his tone heavy with disbelief. It is, Marcus replied calmly. I've owned it for 3 years. The officer squinted at him, then exchanged a glance with his partner. And you're flying it alone? No crew. That's correct, Marcus said, his patience wearing thin. The younger officer smirked. Must be nice, he muttered under his breath. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides but forced himself to stay composed. He knew better than to react. As the officers continued their questioning, a small crowd of airport employees began to gather nearby. Watching the scene unfold, Marcus could feel their eyes on him, their whispers adding to the tension in the air. The older officer stepped closer. Sir, we're going to need to conduct a full background check. Until then, you'll need to step away from the aircraft. Marcus's chest tightened. With all due respect, I've provided you with every document you need. My credentials are in order. Just following protocol, the officer said, his voice laced with condescension. The younger officer chimed in, his smirk widening. If you've got nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem. Marcus took a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm. I understand you have a job to do, he said evenly. But I don't see why this level of scrutiny is necessary. The older officer's gaze hardened. Step away from the plane, sir. Realizing the situation was escalating, Marcus nodded slowly. He reached for his phone and dialed Rebecca Sterling, his lawyer, as he explained the situation. Her voice on the other end was sharp and reassuring. Stay calm, Rebecca said. Do not argue with them. I'm on my way. Marcus hung up and stepped back, his hands at his sides. The officers began speaking into their radios, and the younger one gestured toward the jet, muttering something Marcus couldn't hear. The humiliation was palpable. Marcus glanced at the crowd of onlookers, some of whom were openly staring. Despite his success, his credentials, and his professionalism, he was still being treated as a suspect. As he waited for Rebecca's arrival, Marcus vowed silently. This wasn't over. Marcus stood by the tarmac, his hands in his pockets, masking the simmering frustration that threatened to boil over. The police officers hovered near the jet, their clipped conversations over their radios adding to the tension. Marcus's phone buzzed, breaking his focus. Rebecca Sterling's voice came through the line, sharp and reassuring. Marcus, I'm 5 minutes away. I've contacted airport administration and left messages for the department heads. They know I'm coming. Good, Marcus said, keeping his voice calm. They're still holding me up for no reason. Rebecca paused, her tone hardening. No reason except what's written on their faces. Don't worry, we'll handle this. Just don't let them provoke you. Stay composed. I will, Marcus said, glancing at the gathering crowd of airport staff. But this is already escalating. There are more eyes on me now than there were when this started. Rebecca's tone softened. They'll regret this. Marcus, trust me. I'll be there soon. Marcus ended the call and slipped his phone into his jacket. He turned his attention to the officers, who were now walking back toward him. The older one, his hand resting conspicuously near his holster, seemed ready to confront him again. Mr. Ellington, the officer said, his tone neutral but commanding. We're still verifying your documents. Until then, we need you to cooperate fully. That means no attempts to board your aircraft. Marcus forced himself to stay calm. I've been cooperative since you arrived. You have everything you need to verify my ownership and credentials. I've done nothing wrong. The younger officer smirked, stepping closer. If that's true, then you've got nothing to worry about. We just need to be thorough. You understand, right? Marcus met the officer's gaze, unflinching. What I understand is that I've provided more documentation than most would ever be asked for. I'd like to know why that isn't enough. The older officer interjected, his voice stern. We're the ones asking the questions. Mr. Ellington. The exchange ended abruptly as the distant hum of an approaching car caught everyone's attention. Marcus turned to see a black sedan speeding toward the tarmac. Relief washed over him as Rebecca Sterling stepped out of the car, her presence exuding authority and confidence. Rebecca Sterling, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase, walked with purpose across the tarmac. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step radiating determination. "Who's in charge here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. The older officer stepped forward, his expression guarded. "That would be me. And you are?" "Rebecca Sterling," she replied, holding up her legal credentials. "I'm Mr. Ellington's attorney. I need to know exactly what's happening here and why my client is being detained." The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Rebecca's directness. "We're conducting an investigation. We received a report about suspicious activity involving this aircraft." Rebecca arched an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity? Mr. Ellington is the registered owner and licensed pilot of this jet. He has provided all necessary documentation. What exactly are you investigating?" The younger officer stepped forward, his smirk replaced by a more cautious expression. "We're just doing our due diligence. Ma'am, fraud is common in cases like this." Rebecca turned to Marcus, her gaze steady. "Have they given you a clear reason for this so-called investigation?" "No," Marcus said calmly. "They've been vague from the start." Rebecca turned back to the officers, her tone icy. "You have no grounds to hold my client. Your actions border on harassment and unlawful detention. If you can't provide a valid reason for this delay, I suggest you step aside and let Mr. Ellington proceed with his flight." The older officer stiffened, his authority clearly challenged. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol." Rebecca cut him off. "If that's the case, you should know you're skating dangerously close to a civil rights violation. I've already contacted airport administration and filed a preliminary complaint. Now, unless you want this situation to escalate further, I recommend you end this nonsense immediately." The officers exchanged glances, their confidence visibly shaken. After a tense silence, the older officer finally muttered, "We'll complete our checks and clear him as soon as possible." As the officers retreated, Marcus exhaled slowly, some of the tension lifting. Rebecca stood beside him, her expression still sharp. "They're backing off, but I'm not letting this go. Marcus, they need to be held accountable." Before Marcus could respond, a second car pulled up near the tarmac. From it stepped Evan Richards and Sarah Mitchell, his business partners, their faces etched with concern. "Marcus," Evan called, striding over. "We came as soon as we heard. What's going on here?" Marcus shook his hand, grateful for their presence. "A misunderstanding, apparently," he said dryly. Sarah glanced at the officers, her lips pursed. "This doesn't look like a misunderstanding. It looks like harassment." Rebecca stepped in. "That's exactly what it is. But I'm handling it." She turned to Evan and Sarah. "Thank you for coming. Your support will help reinforce how unacceptable this situation is." Evan's jaw tightened as he looked at Marcus. "They're holding up the merger for this? It's disgraceful." "We'll get back on track," Marcus assured him. "But we're not letting this slide." The officers returned, visibly subdued. The older one handed Marcus's documents back with a curt nod. "Everything checks out. You're free to go." Marcus accepted the papers, his expression unreadable. "That's it." The officer hesitated, then added, "We were just doing our jobs." Rebecca stepped forward. "Your job was handled poorly, to say the least. Expect to hear from us soon." As the officers retreated to their patrol car, Rebecca turned to Marcus. "I've already filed the necessary complaints. This isn't over." "Thank you." Rebecca, Marcus said quietly. Evan clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Let's focus on the merger. This ordeal won't stop us. Sarah nodded. Agreed. But we need to address this publicly. It's bigger than just today. Marcus looked at the jet, then back at his team. We will. But first, let's close this deal. As they boarded the plane, the morning's tension lingered, but a renewed sense of purpose filled the cabin. Marcus knew the fight for justice had just begun. But for now, it was time to move forward. The hum of the jet engines as Marcus Ellington's private aircraft soared above the clouds was usually a source of comfort. Today, it felt like white noise over the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. Sitting in the cockpit, Marcus went through his post-takeoff routine mechanically, his focus fractured by the events on the tarmac. In the passenger cabin, Evan Richards and Sarah Mitchell, Marcus's business partners, sat quietly. The tension from the morning's ordeal hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Sarah broke the silence first. Marcus, she called, leaning toward the cockpit. We need to talk about what happened back there. That wasn't just a hiccup. It was systemic. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his seat and swiveling to face her. I know, but right now, I need to focus on getting us to New York and salvaging this merger meeting. Evan leaned forward, his expression serious. The deal is important, but we can't let this go unchallenged. If this can happen to you, someone as successful and prepared as you, imagine what others without your resources face every day. Marcus nodded slowly. You're right. I've been dealing with these subtle and not so subtle forms of prejudice for years, but this felt different, more brazen. Sarah's brow furrowed. Exactly. They didn't just doubt you, they tried to undermine everything you've built. It's not just about the business. It's about respect. And the fact that we had to scramble to defend your legitimacy is unacceptable. Evan's voice softened. We've got your back, Marcus. Whatever you decide to do about this, we'll support you. But first, let's make sure the deal goes through. Marcus appreciated their support, even as the knot in his stomach tightened. His life's work had been to shatter barriers and rise above expectations. But the morning's incident was a stark reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice could be. He turned back to the controls, his resolve strengthening with every passing mile. By the time the plane touched down in New York, Marcus had regained his focus. The sleek skyline of Manhattan came into view as they drove toward the towering office building where the merger negotiations were set to take place. Inside the conference room, the tension was thick. Representatives from the partnering firm sat around a long glass table, their expressions ranging from impatience to mild concern. Marcus, Evan, and Sarah entered, apologizing for their delayed arrival. Mr. Ellington, one of the senior executives said, his tone polite but clipped. We were beginning to worry that you wouldn't make it. Apologies for the delay, Marcus said smoothly, taking his seat. We had some unexpected challenges at the airport. However, I assure you, my focus is entirely on this deal. Evan and Sarah quickly picked up where they had left off in previous discussions, presenting financial projections and growth strategies. Marcus, despite his lingering frustration, delivered a compelling vision for the future of the merged company. His passion and expertise filled the room, drawing even the most skeptical attendees into his narrative. As the hours passed, the initial tension gave way to cautious optimism. By the time the meeting concluded, the handshake Marcus exchanged with the firm's CEO felt solid and promising. Your vision is impressive, Mr. Ellington, the CEO said, smiling. We look forward to seeing what we can achieve together. The relief Marcus felt after the successful meeting was short-lived. As he, Evan, and Sarah exited the building, reporters swarmed them. Word of the airport incident had spread, and the media was eager for a statement. Mr. Ellington, is it true you were detained at the airport this morning? Do you believe the officer's actions were racially motivated? Will you be filing charges against the police department? Marcus raised his hands to calm the crowd, his expression composed but serious. "I'll make a brief statement," he said, his deep voice cutting through the clamor. The events at the airport this morning were both disappointing and unacceptable. Despite providing all necessary documentation, I was subjected to unwarranted scrutiny and delays. This is not just about me. It's about the systemic challenges many face simply for existing in spaces where they are unjustly questioned. My team and I are exploring all legal avenues to address this, and we hope this serves as a catalyst for change. The reporters pressed for more, but Marcus nodded toward his team, signaling that it was time to leave. Back in their car, Sarah checked her phone. "Social media is already blowing up. Your statement's going viral." Evan smirked. "Good. Let the world see the hypocrisy for what it is." Marcus glanced out the window, his reflection merging with the city lights. The attention was welcome, but it came with a responsibility he couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, the media frenzy only grew. News outlets ran stories about Marcus's airport ordeal, framing it as a glaring example of racial profiling. Social media exploded with hashtags like #FlyWithDignity and #AviationJustice, sparking conversations about systemic racism in high-profile industries. Rebecca Sterling, true to her word, filed a formal lawsuit against the police department and the airport administration. She appeared on news programs, articulating the legal and moral issues at play. "This isn't just about one man's experience," Rebecca said during a live interview. "This is about a system that consistently undermines the legitimacy of Black professionals and entrepreneurs, regardless of their credentials or accomplishments." The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the aviation and law enforcement communities. The police department issued a tepid statement, claiming they were reviewing protocols, while the airport announced new mandatory diversity training programs. Marcus, meanwhile, maintained a delicate balance. He continued working on the merger while participating in carefully planned interviews. In one particularly poignant segment on a national news program, he recounted his experience with calm determination. "What happened to me is something many people face in various forms, often without the resources to fight back," Marcus said. "I want to use this moment to highlight the need for systemic change, not just in aviation, but in every industry where unconscious bias creates barriers." The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Messages poured in from strangers, business leaders, and civil rights advocates. Some praised Marcus for his composure, while others shared their own stories of discrimination, thanking him for using his platform to speak out. Still, Marcus knew the road ahead would be long. Legal battles were rarely quick or straightforward, and changing entrenched systems required persistence. But as he sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the merger documents, Marcus felt a quiet resolve. His success had always been about more than wealth or status. It was about creating a legacy, one that would pave the way for others to rise above the same barriers he had faced. The airport incident had been an affront to everything he stood for, but it had also galvanized him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a future where no one would have to prove their worth simply to be treated with dignity. The fight wasn't over, but Marcus Ellington was ready for whatever came next. As the news of Marcus Ellington's ordeal spread, the backlash against the police department and the airport administration intensified. Activists and advocacy groups took up his cause, organizing protests and campaigns that called for accountability. Social media was a storm of outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForEllington trending for days. However, the backlash wasn't one-sided. Certain voices defended the actions of the officers and airport staff, claiming that they were just following protocol. Online trolls criticized Marcus, accusing him of using his race to gain sympathy. The noise was deafening, but Marcus remained calm. Rebecca Sterling, his lawyer, saw the divide as an opportunity. "This polarization is exactly why we need to press forward," she told Marcus during a late-night strategy session. "The more people talk about it, the more they'll realize how pervasive the problem is." Marcus nodded. "I just hope this doesn't overshadow the merger." We've worked too hard for it to get derailed. Rebecca's gaze was steady. It won't. You've got the truth on your side, Marcus, and the people who matter are paying attention. Amid the chaos, Marcus received a flood of support from influential figures. CEOs, public officials, and celebrities reached out, offering solidarity and pledging to join the fight against systemic discrimination. One letter from a young black pilot in training stood out. "Mr. Ellington, your story gives me hope. I faced so many doubts about my dream of becoming a pilot, but seeing someone like you succeed inspires me to keep going. Thank you for fighting for all of us." Reading it, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just about him. It was about breaking barriers for future generations. Rebecca filed a formal civil rights lawsuit against the police department and the airport administration. The lawsuit accused them of racial profiling, unlawful detention, and violating Marcus's rights as a private citizen. The filing sparked immediate media coverage, intensifying the scrutiny on both institutions. Rebecca's team gathered evidence meticulously, compiling statements from witnesses, video footage from airport cameras, and detailed documentation of Marcus's ownership of the jet. Every detail painted a clear picture. Marcus had been singled out not for his actions, but for who he was. During a press conference, Rebecca didn't mince words. "This case is about more than one man's experience," she said. "It's about a pattern of systemic injustice that undermines the rights and dignity of black professionals. We intend to hold every party involved accountable and push for meaningful reform." The lawsuit placed immense pressure on the defendants. The police department launched an internal investigation, placing the officers involved on administrative leave. The airport's leadership scrambled to issue statements, pledging to review their policies and implement diversity training. But Marcus knew that public apologies weren't enough. "We need real, enforceable changes," he told Rebecca. Words without action mean nothing. As the legal battle gained traction, Marcus continued to balance his fight for justice with his responsibilities as CEO. His days were a blur of meetings, media appearances, and strategy sessions, but he refused to let exhaustion slow him down. One evening, as Marcus sat in his office, a thought struck him. The lawsuit was a powerful tool for accountability, but it wasn't enough to create lasting change. If he truly wanted to make a difference, he needed to build something that would outlast this moment. When Evan and Sarah joined him the next morning, Marcus shared his vision. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," he said, "something that addresses the barriers people like us face not just in aviation, but in every industry where we're underrepresented." Evan leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What kind of initiatives are you thinking?" "Three main pillars," Marcus said. "First, education, scholarships and mentorship programs for underrepresented youth who want to pursue careers in aviation and beyond. Second, legal aid for those who can't fight back against injustice the way we've been able to. And third, policy reform, advocating for systemic changes that prevent this kind of discrimination from happening in the first place." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's incredible, Marcus. It's ambitious, but it's exactly what's needed. You're not just fighting your battle. You're fighting for everyone." Evan nodded. "Count me in. Whatever you need. I'm on board." Inspired by their enthusiasm, Marcus reached out to his network, enlisting allies from various industries to help launch the foundation. Within weeks, plans were underway for a high-profile event to announce the initiative. As the foundation took shape, the defendants in the lawsuit began making overtures for a settlement. The airport administration offered a formal apology and proposed sweeping changes to their policies, including mandatory diversity training for all staff and new protocols for handling private flights. Rebecca brought the proposal to Marcus. "It's a good starting point," she said, "but we need to ensure they follow through. I'd recommend including an independent oversight committee to monitor their compliance." Marcus agreed. "We'll accept nothing less. This isn't about PR. It's about accountability." The police department, under immense pressure, also initiated reforms. The officers involved faced disciplinary action, and the department announced a partnership with a civil rights organization to review their training programs. Marcus met with representatives from both institutions in a series of tense but productive discussions. During one particularly heated meeting with the airport CEO, Marcus made his stance clear. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. If you're serious about change, prove it not with words, but with actions." By the end of the negotiations, Marcus felt cautiously optimistic. The agreements were far from perfect, but they marked a step forward. The reconciliation culminated in a public event where Marcus stood alongside representatives from the airport and police department. While their statements were carefully crafted, Marcus's words carried the weight of lived experience. "I'm here today because I refuse to let what happened to me be forgotten," he said. "This is a moment for change, but change requires action. I'll be watching, and so will the world." The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus knew the work was far from over. The foundation launch was just around the corner, and his fight for justice was only beginning. The grand ballroom at one of New York City's most iconic venues shimmered with elegance. Silver and gold decorations complemented the sleek design of the Ellington Aviation logo projected onto the walls. Guests from all walks of life filled the room: business leaders, activists, politicians, and journalists, all gathered for the launch of the Ellington Foundation for Equity and Opportunity. Marcus Ellington stood at the center of it all, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, his usual calm demeanor carrying a touch of solemn pride. The weeks leading up to the event had been relentless, filled with legal battles, public appearances, and endless planning. But tonight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. As the lights dimmed, a spotlight illuminated the stage. Marcus stepped forward, greeted by applause that grew louder as he raised a hand in acknowledgement. He let the applause settle before speaking, his deep, steady voice filling the room. "Good evening," he began, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Tonight is not just about the launch of a foundation. It's about a vision, a future where barriers are not dictated by the color of your skin, the weight of your bank account, or the zip code you were born in." The room fell silent, captivated by his words. The Ellington Foundation was born out of a moment of injustice. Marcus continued, "But it's not driven by anger. It's fueled by hope. Hope that we can create opportunities for those who've been overlooked. Hope that we can ensure no one has to fight alone against systemic discrimination. And hope that we can leave the world better than we found it." Marcus outlined the foundation's pillars: scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing aviation careers, legal aid for victims of racial profiling, and a policy advocacy arm aimed at driving systemic change. He shared the story of a young black pilot in training who had written to him, emphasizing why this work mattered. "People like that young man," Marcus concluded, his voice steady, "are why we're here tonight. This is our moment to ensure that dreams are not just aspirations. They are achievable realities." The audience erupted into a standing ovation. Marcus stepped back, overwhelmed by the support and energy in the room. As the evening unfolded, donors pledged millions to the foundation's initiatives. The event marked not only the launch of a new chapter for Marcus, but also the beginning of a movement that promised to leave a lasting impact. Late that night, long after the ballroom had emptied and the guests had gone, Marcus sat alone in his office, gazing out at the glittering New York skyline. The city was alive with energy, yet he felt a rare moment of stillness. The weight of the past few months pressed heavily on him. He thought about his journey, the boy from Atlanta who had fallen in love with the idea of flight, who had spent hours poring over books about aviation, dreaming of one day owning a plane. Marcus reflected on the hurdles he'd faced along the way, the rejection letters from flight schools that doubted his potential, the silent stares in boardrooms where he was the only black man in the room, and the whispers behind his back as he climbed higher than anyone thought he could. But he also thought of the mentors who had believed in him, the friends who had stood by his side, and the moments of triumph that reminded him why he kept going. He pulled out a photo from his desk drawer, an image of his late father standing beside a young Marcus, beaming with pride as they looked at a model airplane they'd built together. His father's words echoed in his mind. Never let anyone tell you what you can't do. You define your own limits. Marcus smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every dreamer who dared to reach beyond what the world told them was possible. Months later, the courtroom was packed as Marcus's lawsuit reached its conclusion. The proceedings had been grueling, with both the airport administration and police department fighting to deflect blame. But Rebecca Sterling had been relentless, dismantling their arguments piece by piece. On the final day, the judge's ruling was clear. Marcus's rights had been violated, and the actions of the officers and airport staff had been driven by racial bias. The court ordered both institutions to pay significant damages and implement the reforms agreed upon during negotiations. The victory was bittersweet for Marcus. The financial settlement was substantial, but it wasn't about the money, it was about the precedent. The ruling sent a powerful message that systemic discrimination would no longer be tolerated. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Marcus and Rebecca. Cameras flashed as Marcus addressed the crowd. "This ruling isn't just a win for me," he said. "It's a win for everyone who's ever been doubted, dismissed, or discriminated against because of who they are. But this is only one step in a much larger fight. We have to keep pushing for change. Not just in courtrooms, but in boardrooms, classrooms, and communities." Rebecca stood beside him, her expression proud but resolute. "This case proves that justice is possible," she added. "But justice should never have to be fought for, it should be guaranteed. That's the world we're striving to build." The crowd cheered, and Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fight had been long, but it was worth every moment. A year later, Marcus stood on the tarmac of a small airfield, watching as a group of young aviation students prepared for their first flight lessons. The Ellington Foundation scholarship program had grown rapidly, enabling dozens of underrepresented students to pursue their dreams of becoming pilots, engineers, and aerospace professionals. Marcus smiled as he greeted the students, their excitement reminding him of his younger self. "Remember," he told them, "there's no limit to how high you can fly if you're willing to put in the work." The students beamed, their determination palpable. Later that evening, Marcus returned to his private jet for a flight to Washington, D.C., where he was scheduled to testify before Congress on aviation policy reform. His work with the foundation had opened doors to conversations he never thought possible, and he was determined to use his voice to advocate for systemic change. As the jet soared into the sky, Marcus looked out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the challenges, the victories, and the people who had supported him along the way. He wasn't just flying toward another destination. He was charting a new path forward, a path where dreams were no longer limited by prejudice, where justice was not a privilege but a right, and where the sky was truly the limit for everyone. And as the plane climbed higher, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that the legacy he was building would lift others to heights they had only imagined. The future was his to shape, and he intended to make every moment count.